Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Brian Leiter. He is Karl N. Llewellyn Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of Chicago and founder and director of the Chicago Center for Law, Philosophy, and Human Values. He's the author of several books, including Nietzsche on Morality, Naturalizing Jurisprudence, Why Tolerate Religion, and more recently, Moral Psychology with Nietzsche. So, Dr. Leiter, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me, and I congratulate you on an.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the kind words. Okay, so let me first ask you, why is it that you focus so much of your work on Nietzsche? I mean, why this philosopher specifically? Is it because he has certain unique insights in terms of the topics you're interested in, or something else?
Well, that's an interesting question. Of course, we can give that a Nietzschean answer in terms of what it reveals about my character and my drives and my psychology, or we could give it a more conventional philosophical answer. Let me do something maybe a little closer to the first. I became very interested in Nietzsche as an undergraduate at university. I was actually in an undergraduate course taught by the philosopher Richard Rorty. It was a course he gave on 19th century philosophy. That was the first time I read Nietzsche. And I found him fascinating. Now, it was partly some of the first things we read sort of had a kind of existentialist theme to them. And I had studied Sartre previously in high school. I was then and am still an atheist, so Nietzsche's outlook sort of appealed to me. But there was something deeply engaging about Nietzsche, about his contrarian attitude towards everything. And then I started to dig deeper into it. Now, interestingly, as I got further and further into it, some of my initial impressions of Nietzsche changed. In retrospect, I think Richard Rorty got Nietzsche quite wrong in several respects, but that's okay. So I do think Nietzsche is profoundly challenging. Look, the other 19th century German philosopher I'm quite interested in is Karl Marx. And I do think the two of them make a very interesting contrast. As I often say, you know, Marx has no psychology. He's all sociology, economics, kind of anthropology. And Nietzsche's all psychology without any sociology, economics, or anthropology. So the two of them together make a kind of interesting pair. And of course, they loom very large over the 19th century thought and of course, 20th century thought. So that's sort of an autobiographical answer. To some extent, I became more interested in topics that I saw Nietzsche had things to say about, such as psychology, such as moral psychology, such as the nature of agency. Right? And that drove me deeper into philosophical and empirical psychological literatures on those topics.
Mm-hmm. So before we get into some specific answers about Nietzsche's specific questions, about Nietzsche's moral philosophy / psychology, let me just ask you, because Nietzsche tends to have this sort of aphoristic style of writing. I mean, is it really easy or even possible to pin down any philosophical system that he had? I mean, because sometimes I just wonder while asking these questions if it's really possible to have a concrete answer to them.
Yeah, it's a fair question. Let me say something first about the aphoristic style, which is not all his writing is aphoristic.
Sure.
Though some of, he's well known for certain aphorisms, of course. But some of his writing is more discursive, though very little of it is written in the conventional philosophical manner. That is, he doesn't advance a thesis and then give arguments for the thesis. And the reason for that is because he believes, I think correctly, that arguments are not very effective at changing people's views. That would be a simple way to put it. Or as he says in Twilight of the Idols, he says, nothing is easier to erase than a dialectical effect. He's about Socrates. So he writes in a way, in a very different way, because he really wants to engage his readers at a kind of subconscious or emotional level. Because one of his general philosophical views, and now this comes to the question of systematic views, one of his general views is that that we are fundamentally non-rational creatures, and our affects or emotions, right, are essential for what we believe and what we do. So if you don't change people's affects or emotions, you won't change their views about morality, for example. It won't do to simply give philosophical arguments against morality. So his writing style is sometimes aphoristic, but more generally, it is polemical, it's rude, it's funny, it's insulting. Right? It's very unusual for a philosopher, but that's the reason why he writes this way, because he has this underlying view about how do you actually affect people. Now, I don't think Nietzsche has a system in the manner of, say, at one extreme, Hegel, right, where everything fits together. And you can write an encyclopedia of the philosophical sciences, right? Nietzsche wouldn't do that. On the other hand, I do think Nietzsche has, at least in his mature period, roughly from 1881 until 1888, his last productive year of writing, he has consistent views, and there is an underlying set of views about the nature of mind, the nature of agency, about morality, about Christianity. And this fairly coherent set of views informs or animates a lot of the things he says. Right? Now, it is challenging to try to reconstruct what that coherent set of views are, partly because of the style of writing. But I think some people are too quick to dismiss the idea that that there is a coherent or systematic way of thinking about a set of problems in Nietzsche. And I think that's because it's hard work in order to figure out what it is and produce the evidence for it. So, but I think by this point in time, we've had enough, I think very compelling systematic accounts of different aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy that I think we can be reasonably confident that that he's more coherent in his outlook than the aphoristic style might suggest.
Right, fair enough. So in terms of his moral philosophy, I mean, what were his thoughts on moral realism? Was he a moral realist in any way or not?
Well, so I think one thing most people agree on, of course, there are always interpreters with different views out there, but I think people who have read Nietzsche going back to Max Weber, Thomas Mann, more recently Alistair MacIntyre, all agree that he is a moral anti-realist. That is, he clearly does not think that there is an objectively true morality, right? That is timeless and universal, right? I go a little bit further. I don't think he thinks there are any objective values, because not every judgment of value is a moral judgment of value. There are, for example, aesthetic judgments of value, but they're also the kinds of value judgments that Nietzsche himself makes when he judges that some people are higher human beings and have more value than the herd, right? Which is Nietzsche's unflattering term for the vast majority of us, the herd. So Nietzsche himself makes value judgments, and my view is, and this is a more controversial view the secondary literature, that he is an anti-realist about all judgments of value, that there are, to be a little more precise, no mind or attitude independent facts about what is valuable. Right? Judgments of value all reflect, right, the affects or emotions of the judger. Right? So there is no mind independent or attitude independent moral reality or evaluative reality. So that's the basic answer to your question.
Mm-hmm. Did he have any evolutionary perspective on the origins of human morality? I mean, what did he have to say about where our morals come from?
Well, so he was certainly very interested in the question, where did our 19th century European morality come from? Mm-hmm. When you say, does he have an evolutionary perspective, it would be wrong to think he has an evolutionary perspective in the Darwinian sense.
Right.
Evolutionary perspective, though he was familiar with Darwin, and he was familiar with Lamarck, who was the 19th century Darwinian, who argued that children could inherit the acquired characteristics of their parents. Which isn't quite as crazy as it first sounds, and maybe we'll talk about that later. But in general, his interest in the history of morality was not informed by anything like, adaptationist or natural selection accounts, right? The kind that we find in contemporary evolutionary psychology or sociobiology. But he was very interested in the question, how did the particular set of values that we find in 19th century Judeo-Christian European morality, where in the world did it come from, right? And it was very important to him to recognize that it was a historical artifact, right? That moralities were different at different times and in different places, right? In one of his most famous books on the genealogy of morality, he offers 3 accounts of different sources of our morality. And I suppose the most important thing to say is he thinks plausibly that the psychological historical origins of our morality are quite diffuse. There are a lot of different influences that are going into it. Right? So in the famous first essay of the genealogy, he suggests that our morality derives in part from something he called the slave revolt in morals. Right? So he points out, partly relying on etymological evidence, that the distinction between good and bad in, think of Homer's epics, right? Or think of the Roman Empire at its peak, but let's talk about Homeric ethics, that the good-bad distinction in those moralities was very, very different than the good-evil distinction in Christian morality, right? That in the Homeric ethics, we start with, as it were, a kind of self-appraisal of those who are rulers or masters or dominant, right? Morality begins as a kind of self-glorification, as he puts it. And what this morality celebrates are things like strength and wealth and the ability to exact revenge, right? And sexual pleasure and satisfaction and so on. In other words, it's the exact opposite of Christian morality, right? And Nietzsche's suggestion is that Christian morality was a kind of inversion of this earlier way of evaluating people, right? Where the good of Homeric ethics becomes something like the evil of Christian morality, right? And the bad of Homeric ethics, where bad means something more like contemptible, right? Kind of pathetic, those who aren't Homeric heroes, right? That the bad of Homeric ethics becomes something like the good of Christian morality, the meek, the humble, right? The poor, right? These all become the positive states of that. So he's identified an historical event that it is a real historical event. There is some kind of dramatic change that occurs over a couple of hundred years between the outlook of what I'll just call very crudely the Homeric world and the outlook of the Christian world. Right? So that's been part of what's gone into modern morality, though, as he likes to say, there are traces of master morality even today, right? That, it's still a mix. As I like to point out, think of the fascination, especially in the United States, but I think this is true in Europe too, the fascination with mafia movies, right? Sort of celebrate, they romanticize the mafia figures, right? The Godfather, okay? Is The Godfather popular in Portugal?
Yes, I've watched all three of the movies. Yeah.
So they're well known. Right? I mean, the fascination of them is that they portray the mafia figures as a little bit like Homeric heroes, right? They're powerful, they control things, they exact revenge, right? They believe in a certain kind of honor and loyalty. I think, Nietzsche would point to that as evidence that there's aspects of the old master morality or Homeric ethics that still resonate with us. The fact that we still study the Homeric epics, that they're still of such great interest, is indicative that the slave revolt hasn't been entirely successful. Yeah? But that's just one story he tells. In the second essay, The Genealogy, he wants to understand the phenomenon of how did we human beings develop the capacity to feel guilty? Right? Where did that come from? The ability to have a bad conscience, and specifically a guilty conscience. And here his hypothesis, which Freud took up then in Civilization and Its Discontent, starts with the idea that human beings are essentially aggressive. More precisely for Nietzsche, he thinks one of the basic human drives, right? And Nietzsche is a key part of his psychology is to identify the basic drives that animate human beings, that move us to act. He thinks one of our basic drives is a drive towards cruelty, right? That human beings take great pleasure in cruelty. And at the same time, you can't have a human society if everybody is simply acting out their desire to be cruel or aggressive towards other people. And so this requires, as it were, a repression of our innate cruelty. And Nietzsche shares with Freud may have gotten the idea from Nietzsche, what you might call a hydraulic picture of the mind, right? That it drives, right? There's this energy. And if it doesn't get to be released outwards, it has to go somewhere else. Right? It's got to get directed somewhere else. Right? So, it's like if you have a pitcher of water, right? And then you put a lid on it and start pushing the lid down, the water leaks out the side. It's got to go somewhere. Okay? And so Nietzsche thinks if human societies need to repress cruelty and aggression, it has to go somewhere. He thinks it turns inwards and manifests itself in a bad conscience, in the ability human beings have to think about what we're doing and, as it were, punish ourselves for it, to torture ourselves for it, right? In the Christian case, right, the doctrine of original sin is an extreme form of this, okay? The minute you arrive on the planet, you are already guilty, thanks to your distant ancestors in the Garden of Eden. And then in the third essay, The Genealogy, and if you don't want me to go on with this, we can change the topic, but in the third essay, he tells yet another story, right? So in the second essay, the first essay, the slave revolt and morals. The second essay, how we develop the capacity to feel guilty. In the third essay, right, he wants to understand what is indeed a puzzling feature about human moralities, right, which is that they are all, as he says, ascetic. Right? They all embrace what he calls the ascetic ideal, ideals of self-denial. Right? He says the three key words of the ascetic ideal are poverty, chastity, right, and humility. Right? And it's true that ours, as Nietzsche says, is the ascetic planet par excellence. Right? We have the Taliban in Afghanistan. Theirs is a very aesthetic set of teachings, a lot of self-denial. And if you won't deny yourself, they'll make you deny yourself, right? But same thing with Orthodox versions of Christianity, of Judaism, and so on. And Nietzsche's question is, why in the world do we find these kinds of moralities all over the place? Right? Why?
Right.
Those have been so attractive to people. And his answer to this is somewhat complicated. And I'm gonna try to simplify it, and then you can press me on the details. But the basic idea is that for most people, ascetic moralities, ascetic religions, right, render their innate suffering intelligible, meaningful. That is, Nietzsche, most people suffer by nature, right?
Right.
He refers to most people as, physiologically damaged and disgruntled, right? So most people suffer. It's just part of the human condition, right? And Nietzsche thinks suffering without a meaning is unbearable. He says suffering is not unbearable as long as it means something, right? As long as there's a meaning to your suffering, people will seek out suffering. And this is an astute observation. Meaningless suffering is unbearable. And what religions do by teaching people ascetic ideals, right, is they say to people, look, in order to lead a good life, to be looked on favorably by God or by Allah or whoever, right, you have to observe these ascetic ideals. You have to practice chastity, humility, poverty. And Nietzsche thinks most people can't do that. Most people want sex. Most people want money. Most people want power and status, okay? And this is what makes their suffering intelligible, because God tells them they ought to live one way, and they know in their heart they want to live the opposite way. And now they understand why they suffer, because they're not doing what God wants them to do, right? That they are always trying to defy the ascetic ideal that God has laid down for them. And that's why I suffer. In Christianity, this is clearest, right? You suffer because you're a sinner, right? You don't live up to the ascetic ideal. Okay. Those are just three examples of explanations, historical explanation Nietzsche tries to give. Though I should emphasize, and that's probably clear, they're very much psychological explanations, right? That is, they don't consider the sociology or the economics of the Roman Empire that led, Constantine to convert to Christianity in the 4th century AD. No, they don't get into any of that. They're concerned with the psychological mechanism. So the slave revolt in morality arises from ressentiment, right? He's using the German word for a kind of sort of impotent hatred and lust for revenge, right? And he thinks that's what the slaves feel towards their masters. And since they can't actually overthrow them, they invert the values of the masters, right? That's the simple idea. But let me stop there and ask if you want to follow up on any parts of that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, let me start with this then. Did Nietzsche have any notion of perhaps putting, when it comes to the origins of our morality, did he think about it in terms of, for example, it having a biological basis versus being the result of environmental influences? Did he have any, did he thought about it in those terms, like, for example, many psychologists think about it nowadays, or not?
As I say, he's not an evolutionary psychologist.
Right.
I actually think contemporary evolutionary psychology is a bogus science. That's a separate issue we could talk about. But Nietzsche didn't adopt that view. Now, he certainly didn't think it was only the environment, because it's crucial on Nietzsche's view that human beings, by their very nature, have certain basic psychological traits and dispositions, or as he likes to say, drives. Right? So people have certain basic drives, including a drive to power, towards cruelty, right, and towards sexual gratification, and so on. I think there's no question that if you had asked Nietzsche well, do you think that these basic psychological drives of human beings have a biological or a physiological basis? He would have said yes. Okay. That idea was important in the 19th century. He was familiar with it. This is something many people don't know about Nietzsche. You know, he was trained as a classical philologist, what we would call classics now.
Right.
So he studied Greek and Roman history, language, philosophy, culture, and so on. But in his early 20s, he became very, very interested in the natural sciences of his day because of a book that was a very well-known book in the 19th century by a man named Friedrich Lange called The History of Materialism. Bertrand Russell wrote the introduction to the English translation in the early 20th century. So that gives you an idea of how well-known the book had become by then. Yeah. And History of Materialism by Friedrich Lange, Nietzsche learned about all these developments in the modern life sciences. So 19th century Germany was the birthplace of modern physiology, right? Hermann von Helmholtz, you know, but many other lesser known figures as well. So Nietzsche became very, very interested in all this stuff, right? He even wrote to someone in his mid-20s, he said, you know, I should have studied medicine or physiology, right? But he became an avid autodidactic consumer of all this scientific literature, right? But he himself was no physiologist, right? He was no biologist. So he often sort of makes references to the physiological or biological, you know, possible grounds or roots of different psychological phenomena, but he has nothing to say about it. His talent is as it were, a psychological diagnostician, right? He is very good at speculating and being able to infer from what you can observe general psychological tendencies in people, right? So he would have said, yes, of course, it must have a biological or physiological basis, but he doesn't really have much to say about that. You know, for listeners who are interested in this issue, I do recommend the book that's just about to appear by Mattia Riccardi, who teaches at the University of Porto, who's a very good Nietzsche scholar, also a philosopher of mind. It's a book called Nietzsche's Philosophical Psychology. And he does identify places in Nietzsche where contemporary reading he was doing in biology or physiology was directly influencing some of his claims. Right? So maybe on a future episode, you will talk with Mattia about this very issue. So that's, but he doesn't really, he has no original contribution to make in this area. He's a consumer of ideas, but his original contributions are in the domain of what we would call psychology.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to get a little bit more into other psychological phenomena that Nietzsche talked about. For example, you mentioned drives. What about the concept of affect? I mean, what does it mean for Nietzsche, and does it play a role in human morality?
Yeah, good. Okay, so affect is a term Nietzsche often uses, and in fact, the German word is almost exactly the same as the English word. He sometimes, I think he uses it interchangeably quite a lot with feeling, the fool. Mm-hmm. You know, so affect, feelings, emotions, I think all those English words sort of capture what he's after. Okay?
Right.
Here's how I would suggest thinking about it, and this is a characterization that I owe to a scholar named Paul Katsafanis, but I think he gets this quite right. That drives for Nietzsche are kind of standing dispositions to have certain kinds of affective responses. Okay, so the drive, right? If you're a man sexually attracted to women, that is a kind of standing disposition to feel sexually aroused in the presence of a naked woman, for example. Okay? So the drive is a disposition to have a certain kind of affective or emotional response. Crucially for Nietzsche, Nietzsche thinks that all our experiences of the world, pretty much all the time, are laden with affects or feelings. Right? There is almost never something like a purely disinterested experience. Right? It's always affectively charged, right? With a certain feeling or a certain coloration or a certain sense of its value or disvalue. Okay? And Nietzsche thinks that the sense that things are good or bad, splendid or contemptible, arises from an affective response, right, to people, to actions, and so on. Right? At its most basic level, he thinks that it starts with learning as children basic responses of inclination and aversion, right? So we learn from our parents that certain things we should be inclined towards and other things we should develop an aversion towards, right? But then as it evolves into a full-blown morality, right, it gets much more complicated, right? So for example, we learn to have feelings about our basic dispositions of inclination and aversion. Right? And what feelings we're taught to have about inclinations and aversions are going to depend on the culture that we're in. Right? So to borrow, and I'm going to modify it slightly, an example of Nietzsche's. Suppose somebody just finds that they have a kind of instinctive aversion to confronting someone who seems dangerous or powerful, right? So if they're around someone, tough guy, right? They kind of back away, right? Their basic instinct is to retreat, to hide. Now, if you have that kind of basic aversion and you grow up in Homeric culture, you're going to develop a feeling about that aversion, namely shame, right? Because that's shameful. Right? In Homeric culture, it's completely shameful not to confront, a dangerous enemy, but to feel like you want to retreat. On the other hand, child in Christian culture is going to develop a very good feeling. They're going to think, I am instinctively humble, right? And peaceful, right? I don't look for confrontation, right? I'm a good person, right? I turn the other cheek when it comes to someone who harms me, right? And of course, the idea of turning the other cheek is completely foreign to a Homeric hero, right? A Homeric hero who turns the other cheek is not a Homeric hero. So it's complicated how we get a whole set of values out of this, but we start with some basic affective responses and then through a process of cultural assimilation, right? As Nietzsche says, children learn by imitating their parents. They imitate the inclinations and aversions of their parents, right? But the parents themselves are, of course, a product of cultures, and they're a product of this history of morality that we were talking about earlier in the interview. Right? So it's a complicated cultural, social, psychological process, but it has its root in affective or emotional responses, right? Such as retreating or feeling aversion towards the dangerous enemy, in the example that I was giving you.
Did Nietzsche also consider things like personality and individual differences?
So the simple answer is yes. I think Nietzsche thought people generally were of certain psychological types, right? Where a psychological type is characterized by a whole set of typical dispositions or drives. Now he didn't use, say, the personality characteristics that contemporary psychologists use now, like introversion and extroversion or neuroticism and so on, though you could fit some of that onto Nietzsche's general way of looking at this. Nietzsche thought one of the basic differences between psychological types was the difference between those who were active and those who were reactive. Right?
Mhm.
That is, the difference between those whose fundamental orientation was to react against things outside of them. Right? So the slaves in the slave revolt and morality are reactive. Right? Their values arise from a reaction to being oppressed by the masters and to desiring revenge against them, but being unable to achieve actual revenge. So they adopt the imaginary revenge of deciding the masters are not, in fact, the good and the great and the wonderful. They're the evil, and we slaves are the good. Whereas the active type is pretty rare. The active type, as it were, has the capacity for what Nietzsche often describes as creating values. So the active type, as it were, acts from a sense of who they are and what's valuable rather than simply being reactive to the world outside them. That's one of the distinctions that he introduces. But his general practice when discussing, for example, other philosophers is to diagnose the psychological type that they represent. Okay. So, for example, Socrates, right? Nietzsche's diagnosis of Socrates is, he says, so Socrates elevates reason and the rational faculties to an extraordinary extent, unlike anyone before him, right? Mm-hmm. Why does he do this, Nietzsche thinks? Nietzsche wonders, and his explanation that he offers in Twilight of the Idols is essentially what Freudians would call it's a reaction formation. Right? In Freudian terminology, a reaction formation occurs when you have some very strong threatening desire or wish, and then you consciously adopt values that are the opposite of it to sort of protect yourself from it. Right? So somebody who has a very strong homosexual desire becomes very vocal about homosexuality being evil to protect themselves from their own desire. Nietzsche thinks Socrates is having a huge reaction formation because his underlying drives and passions are dangerous. They're out of control. They're too strong. And so he's got to valorize reason and rationality as a defense mechanism against his own powerful irrational drives. This is not as crazy a hypothesis as it sounds. I mean, Nietzsche actually, Socrates does occasionally say things where he acknowledges having unruly desires. But that's an example where Nietzsche clearly thinks the type of personality is essential to understanding the philosophy. Right? And that is his general approach with pretty much all the philosophers, is to diagnose the type of person that they are in something like the sense of the type of personality that they represent.
Mm-hmm. What is Nietzsche's position on free will? Because particularly in moral philosophy, people many times bring this issue to the table, and then perhaps we can also get into questions regarding moral responsibility, but what is his position on free will?
Good. So chapter 5 of my recent book, Moral Psychology with Nietzsche, deals with this at great length for anyone who wants to see a written account of this. But the simple answer is he denies that anyone has free will, and he denies that anyone is morally responsible. Now, there are different senses of free will that philosophers have. I think it's pretty clear that Nietzsche denies free will in the two senses that are most familiar in modern philosophy. Right? One is what's called the incompatibilist idea that to act freely, right, is to, as it were, act outside the causal order of nature, right? To not be causally determined by something extraneous to yourself, right? And in particular to your will, right? So a will decides what to do without being causally determined to choose the way that it does. I think everybody agrees Nietzsche rejects that concept of free will. He calls it the contradiction of the causa sui, of being self-caused, right? God is supposedly self-caused, but of course we are not God. The idea of something being the cause of itself makes no sense, right? So everyone, all commentators agree he rejects the incompatibilist idea. But I think it's also important to see that he rejects the whole family of views about free will that are associated with compatibilism. Compatibilism, associated famously with David Hume, gets its name from the idea that free will can be compatible with the causal determination of the will, right? So, in the Humean idea, right, is something like, well, if you do what you desire to do, then you act freely, regardless of how your desires are determined, right? Even if what desires you have is causally determined by something else, you act freely if you do what you desire to do. And then modern Humean compatibilists like Harry Frankfurt have more complicated versions of that kind of picture, right? There's another strand of modern compatibilism, sort of called reasons responsive compatibilism, which I discuss in the book. I think I'm not going to discuss it here. I view this as a little bit of a fad of recent Anglo-American analytic philosophy, an attempt to save moral responsibility by people who otherwise grant a lot of the arguments against it. Against the compatibilist view, I think, Nietzsche has a few things to say, right? First of all, right, there's the problem with the compatibilist view that if you're not responsible for the desires on which you act, why should you be responsible for the act that results from those desires? Okay.
Right.
And there's a version of this objection developed by Galen Strawson, and others have pursued this. But I think Nietzsche is very sympathetic to that thought, right? That if what determines the wants and desires you have are facts about you that you're not responsible for, it's hard to see why you should be responsible for the resulting acts. And on Nietzsche's view, and this is an important part of his philosophical psychology, right? The conscious wants and desires that we have are determined by psychological facts beneath the level of consciousness that we're largely unaware of. Most fundamentally, the drives that we have, right? So the drives on this picture are giving rise to desires and wants, but the drives, we're not responsible for the drives we have. Indeed, sometimes Nietzsche writes, like going back to your early question, that the drives have a kind of physiological basis, right? We're just born with a package of drives, right? And there's no sense in which we are responsible for them. But Nietzsche also thinks, for example, that the kind of conscious deliberation that we engage in before we act, right, is largely epiphenomenal. That is, it isn't causally responsible for what it is we do, right? Yeah. It's like, it's the flotsam on the surface of the ocean, right? It's bouncing along. But what's really driving our action are events, psychological events beneath the level of consciousness. Right? Mattia Riccardi's book, by the way, is very good on this topic. I discuss it somewhat in my book, drawing on some of his earlier articles. Right? So Nietzsche has a pretty radical picture of the mind and agency in this regard. And the upshot is nobody's got free will. Right? And he also thinks no one is morally responsible in the sense of blameworthy, right, or praiseworthy, but blameworthy in particular for the actions that they perform. Right? We are something like, consciously, we are something like spectators, right, on the things that we do, even though we don't experience it that way. Right? And Nietzsche doesn't deny that the first person experience is very different, but it's, a general view of Nietzsche is that an enormous amount of ordinary experience is shot through with illusion and falsehood, right? A lot of what we take ourselves to experience of the world is wrong, right? Including our experience of ourselves as agents, as free agents, or as possessors of free will.
So touching on that bit about consciousness, so what we experience consciously, does it ever have any sort of causal power over our behavior, or is it just a source of post hoc rationalizations or something like that?
So I think we do have to distinguish between different kinds of consciousness. Right?
Okay.
So one kind of consciousness, which is often called phenomenal consciousness, right? So the experiencing of certain sensations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Touching the fire and feeling that it's really too hot, right? Phenomenal consciousness does seem to play a causal role in the things that we do. Okay? The consciousness he's skeptical of is, I'll borrow Riccardi's term, is something like reflective consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. It's where we find ourselves thinking about what it is that we ought to do in some situation, right? And he thinks that is largely epiphenomenal, but I want to be careful here in one respect, right? Because it is possible for thoughts that occur in reflective consciousness, as it were, to get attached to a drive, right? Become affectively charged. Okay. Mm-hmm. Think of it this way. I mean, why is Nietzsche writing books, right? People are reading the books. They're consciously reading the books. They're conscious of reading the books. But part of the idea of the way Nietzsche writes, to go back to something we talked about early on, is that in writing the way he does, he wants to make some of these ideas that he's presenting to consciousness, he wants them to arouse affects, right? So he wants his Christian reader On the Genealogy of Morality to start to experience a certain kind of embarrassment and self-contempt, right? He's embarrassed when he discovers that Christian morality arose from the hatred of the slaves, right? That's embarrassing for a Christian, right? If he believes it to be true. So it is possible for, as it were, things passing through consciousness to become affectively charged. That's the metaphor I'm using. And because of that, to start to have some effects, right? But the reason they will have an effect on our behavior and our other attitudes and beliefs is because they've aroused an affect, because an affect has become attached to them. That, I think, is his picture. So that gives a limited role, right, for even reflective consciousness. But, the idea that you can simply reason yourself into doing something, Nietzsche denies. The only way you're going to do it is if an affect and a drive get behind it, right? That's the only circumstance under which a change in action or attitudes is going to occur.
Mm-hmm. So you've already mentioned a few times the will, but what is really the will for Nietzsche, and where do you place it in relation to other mental phenomena?
Yeah. Well, that's an important question generally in sort of the philosophy of mind and action. What is meant by the will? Mm-hmm. Here's what I take to be an issue for Nietzsche. That is, the will in the first instance it's some sort of internal locus of agency. It's the place in the mind where the decisions to act are made, okay? And a crucial part of most, maybe all pictures of the will is that it's conscious. Right? So that this internal locus of agency is a conscious locus of agency. And on one picture, it chooses what to do through reflection and deliberation. But if Nietzsche's right, then that conscious reflection and deliberation isn't really what's driving the action that results. But I think that's the basic idea he's working with, and I think that's an idea of the will that is implicit and sometimes explicit in the tradition. Now, sometimes Nietzsche proposes alternative ways of understanding the will, but when he's doing that, he's now no longer talking about free will, right? I mean, or sorry, let me put that differently. One of the claims Nietzsche wants to make is there is no will in the sense of a conscious internal locus of agency, right?
Right.
There is the psyche, right? There are the drives that are located in my body, right? And have conscious manifestations in my experience, okay? And the self for Nietzsche is this kind of hierarchy of drives, right? Over which we have a relatively limited amount of control. Or as Nietzsche likes to say, we only exercise control over our drives because another drive prompts us to do so. Right? So, we are the arena in which this battle of the drives is taking place, and we become conscious of some aspects of the battle because drives give rise to feelings or affects, all right? But we don't really control it. We don't really control how this battle plays out, right? As I said before, there's a sense in which we are, if we agree with Nietzsche, that we are kind of spectators on all these things in which we take ourselves to be agents. Now, of course, we ourselves can't conduct our lives that way. We have to act as if we are agents, right? Which is something Kant, of course, believed. But in Nietzsche's view, this is just an illusion. It's one of these indispensable illusions. And as Nietzsche likes to say, illusion and falsehood are essential conditions of life.
Mm-hmm. Does he explain where the so-called death of God and people's turning to atheism come from?
So he has a general suggestion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let me just give a little historical context. Of course, God is dead is Nietzsche's most famous claim. The 19th century was the first century in which you had lots of intellectuals who were openly atheists.
Mm-hmm.
The ground had been laid for this already by the scientific revolution, by the rise of Darwin's theory of evolution, right? Newtonian mechanics. Even in Kant, you find naturalistic accounts of the origins of the universe. So all the traditional reasons for thinking God existed, right, were falling away. You no longer needed God to explain the movements of the planets, right, or the origins of the diversity of species we see in organic life, and so on. I think it was the 1840s, or was it the 1830s? A man named David Strauss wrote a very famous and controversial book called The Life of Jesus, in which he analyzed the New Testament and showed that it was full of inconsistencies and contradictions and couldn't possibly be an actual account of the life of Jesus. And Nietzsche wrote an essay about David Strauss. Feuerbach, who was an openly atheistic philosopher, is writing in the 1840s. Many of the German materialists, these were usually scientists, chemists, biologists, physicians, who were part of this physiological revolution in Germany. Many of them were openly atheists. Okay? So there's a lot of atheism in the air, as it were. As Nietzsche puts it, right, the belief in God has become unbelievable by the time that he's writing. But, and now this is the important point, although God is dead, people don't actually realize the significance of that, right? And this is where now Nietzsche goes in a very different direction from all the contemporary atheists, right? In the famous passage from The Gay Science, which is the book where he first proclaims the death of God, he tells the story of someone he calls the madman, who comes to the town square declaring God is dead and we have killed him, right? And by we have killed him, he means all the achievements of modern science and modern scholarship have rendered belief in God unbelievable. You know? But he calls the character a madman because everybody in the crowd sort of stares at him, right, in amazement. And this is the really important point. Nietzsche says everyone in the crowd is already an atheist, right? And what they don't understand is the madman says, God is dead, we have killed him, and this is a catastrophe that is going to change everything. And all the contemporary atheists, they don't see that. They say, well, we got rid of the stupid church, and we got rid of belief in God, and we got rid of the idea of the soul. So what? We carry on as before. Nietzsche thinks that without the belief in God, without the whole apparatus of Christian metaphysics and cosmology, we're going to undermine all of Christian morality as well. And that's what the people in the crowd don't understand. And this is why the madman concludes his speech by saying, you know, God is dead, we've killed him, but the consequences of that are still far into the future and nobody realizes that. Right? And that's what Nietzsche's most interested in, right? He's making a prediction. I think it turns out to be a false prediction that the decline of religion and belief in God will undermine Judeo-Christian morality. And the reason I say it seems to be a false prediction is it doesn't seem to have worked out that way. That is, take Europe, where religion, you know, religious belief has been in decline, you know, for 150 years now, right? You know, it's not like there's been a return to Homeric ethics. You know, most of the European countries are still social democratic countries. You know, they believe in equality and, you know, and freedom and so on. So it is not clear Nietzsche was right in this prediction, but that's what was really important to him about the death of God, right? Nietzsche takes it for granted that, of course, nobody who thinks about it believes in God, right? What he thinks is important is that people don't see how important the belief in God was. It was like a central pillar in the whole cultural and moral edifice of, you know, modern Europe. That's what he thought. And he thought you knock out that pillar and the whole thing will collapse. And Nietzsche, of course, thought that was wonderful. And if Christian morality collapsed, that would be great. Democracy collapsed, egalitarianism, right? We haven't addressed this directly, but it is important to realize that Nietzsche is a deeply, deeply illiberal, anti-liberal thinker, right? He does not believe in the equality of human beings. He does not believe in the equality of human beings. There are higher and there are lower human beings. And the idea that everyone, in virtue of being human, is deserving of the same kind of equal concern and respect is not an idea he accepts. So he is a radically anti-egalitarian thinker, unlike almost any significant philosopher in the modern era. So that's one of the terrible truths about Nietzsche you have to face up to, right? He's not a nice liberal.
Okay, so let me just take a small step back and ask you. So if people don't have free will, and if most of what's causally important that happens in our minds occur on the plane of the unconscious, and Nietzsche doesn't even believe that much in the causal power of the reflective conscious, let's say. Is there any room in Nietzsche for questioning and reevaluating our moral values?
Okay, good. So, I mean, to revalue our current morality, to revalue our current values would be to develop a different affective or emotional attitude towards them. Okay? Mm-hmm. Because value judgments arise from or constituted by these affective or emotional responses. You know? So if we are going to revalue values, if Nietzsche is going to help at least some readers revalue values, he's got to, as it were, produce the right kind of affective or emotional response in them.
Right.
That brings us back to something I said earlier. This is why he doesn't give discursive, rational, logical arguments. This is why he deploys, he's a great writer. He is one of the two great writers in German of the 19th century. Heine was another favorite of Nietzsche's, probably the other, but he's a great German writer. And he deploys all his rhetorical talents in order to produce these effects, in his Now, Nietzsche does not think that everyone is going to share his evaluative tastes, right? That is, not everybody going to revalue values, right? One of the funny things about Nietzsche is that he's a philosopher who often discourages people from reading him. He says this book is only for the few. If the wrong people hear this, it'll sound like a crime, right? Or Zarathustra, a book for all and for none, right? Paradoxical notion. He doesn't think that this is going to make sense to just anyone, right? So he's got to find his rightful readers. And as he likes to say, right, style, the art of, of having a certain writing style, is a way of excluding people, right? And only including those who get the style. Now, there's an irony here, which is that everybody loves to read Nietzsche in a way that not everybody loves to read Hegel. Right? So Nietzsche's style, in a way, brought him more readers than the typical philosophers. But I take it he thinks a lot of readers don't quite get it. So he thinks that, take the argument in the first essay of the genealogy about the slave revolt and morals. Right? Somebody could read the first essay of the genealogy and say, you're right, Christian morality arose from a slave revolt in values, as Nietzsche calls it, and represented an inversion of the values of the Homeric world, and think, good for the slaves, yay for the slaves. It's about time we got rid of that horrible, master morality in Homeric ethics. Nietzsche doesn't have an argument against that reaction, right? What he tries to do instead is to kind of embarrass his reader, right? To make slave morality look contemptible, look pathetic, to portray it as, consumed with revenge and hatred, right? Which the Christian morality of love, should look a little strange, right? To someone who thinks of Christianity as a religion of love. And, so those are the things he tries to do. Nietzsche thinks that the way I read Nietzsche in this regard is he's trying to reach certain readers, his rightful readers, right? And he thinks for them, it might be possible to change their feelings and affects about the existing morality, right? And then it's the task of his writing to try to produce that emotional or affective response. I'll tell you and give you an anecdote, but it illustrates this very nicely, which is Strindberg, the Swedish playwright, discovered Nietzsche's text. Nietzsche was largely unread during his lifetime, but in 1888, a very well-known Danish critic named Georg Brandes began giving public lectures on Nietzsche's writings. And so this brought him to the attention of other European intellectuals. Strindberg reads Nietzsche and is very impressed and starts writing to Nietzsche. And Strindberg was a little bit of a megalomaniac like Nietzsche, that Strindberg had a very high opinion of himself. And Strindberg writes to Nietzsche and he says, oh, these books are brilliant. And and I realized that, we need to keep these books away from the herd and the rabble, right? That, these books are strictly for geniuses like you and me. And Nietzsche writes back very appreciatively. He doesn't disabuse Strindberg of this way of reading his texts as being addressed, as it were, to other great, geniuses like Nietzsche. So that's how I think he thinks of a revaluation of values. I'm not sure. I think early on, when he was a young man, when he's in his late 20s, early 30s, and at that time he was very enamored of Richard Wagner and was personal friends with Wagner and his family. And Wagner, of course, had a vision of himself as, making 19th century Germany into 5th century Athens, right? Through a cultural transformation brought about by Wagnerian opera. And I think Nietzsche then shared in this idea that culture itself could be transformed. But I think he then abandons that idea. And he thinks of himself as writing only for, the select few, right? Whose consciousness of morality can really be transformed, who can be brought to see how dangerous Christian morality is and adopt a whole new affective, emotional, a whole new set of feelings about existing morality.
Mm-hmm. Would a concept like moral progress make any sense for Nietzsche?
Well, not in the way most people use it, right? That is, most people, and of course, Nietzsche would say, well, that's because of the slave revolt in morals, but most people think of moral progress as, the triumph of egalitarianism, the expanding of individual rights for more and more people, the elimination of all kinds of, arbitrary castes and so on. Nietzsche's pretty clear that he doesn't think of this as progress. He thinks of it as a kind of regress because it's going to produce what he calls the last man, which is an image he invokes at the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, right? That is, the sort of the perfect mediocre herd animal who's complacent, doesn't aspire to anything great, is a happy shopkeeper, right? So Nietzsche thinks of this as a kind of regress, but that's because Nietzsche has his own ideal, right, that he aspires towards, right? That is, he's concerned with the question, what are the conditions under which really great human beings, like Beethoven, like Goethe, two of his favorite examples, what are the conditions under which those kind of people are possible, right? And he doesn't think they're possible when people take Christian morality too seriously. But to give now a more general answer, right? The idea of moral progress presupposes an evaluative judgment, namely that we are doing evaluatively better in virtue of certain things. Since I think Nietzsche is an anti-realist about all evaluative judgments, then I don't think there is any such thing as objective moral progress. But there could be moral or evaluative progress as judged by Nietzsche or as judged by, Aquinas or is judged by, Pope Benedict or whatever, but there isn't any mind independent or attitude independent sense in which things count as moral or evaluative progress, right? And as I say, ironically for Nietzsche, most of what people today call moral progress, I think he pretty clearly does not regard as progress, right? And the explanation is simple, which is he has a different set of values, right, that he's bringing to bear that inform his judgments about the condition of the world.
Right. But I mean, when it comes to his idea of the ideal man, does it come attached to a set of moral values that he thinks people should follow?
Okay, good. So the answer to that is a little complicated. The first has to do with the idea of moral values. Nietzsche is very critical of morality, yet at the same time he says there could be higher moralities.
Right.
So one of the crucial questions in the interpretation of Nietzsche is, what makes a morality the kind of morality that Nietzsche rejects versus the moralities that are okay? I call the moralities Nietzsche rejects morality in the pejorative sense. I sort of give it a name because it's kind of a mix of views. It's, elements of Judeo-Christian morality, of utilitarianism, of Kantianism. There's a lot of different values in this stew, the moral stew. So Nietzsche's own moral values or his higher morality has nothing in common with morality in the pejorative sense, right? So what are the characteristics of morality in the pejorative sense? Well, it includes a notion of the equality of human beings. It assumes that people have free will and can be morally responsible for what they do. It valorizes the elimination of suffering and everything that helps the suffering, right? So altruism is good, right? And humility is good, and charity is good, right? And so on, right? So there's some substantive normative characteristics of it, and then there are kind of metaphysical claims that are associated with morality in the pejorative sense. Nietzsche's own values do not partake of any of that. Nietzsche's evaluative perspective, and many people have remarked on this, it has a kind of aesthetic dimension to it, right? That is, he's concerned with, the conditions under which the most splendid forms of human genius can flourish, right? So Beethoven is a great human being in the Nietzschean evaluative system. Goethe is a great human being, right? And you'll notice evaluative judgments like that don't presuppose anything about free will. They don't commit you to any kind of egalitarianism. They have nothing to do with pity, altruism, humility, or anything like that, right? They're all about greatness, right? They're a little bit more like Homeric ethics, but they're not equivalent to Homeric ethics either, because the substantive values of Homeric ethics aren't of great interest to Nietzsche generally, right? He understands why the Homeric heroes are heroes. I should say in fairness that Nietzsche has 3 examples of really great human beings. I've mentioned 2 of them, Beethoven and Goethe. The third is Napoleon. There's a 4th, which is Nietzsche himself. But the 3 he talks most about are Goethe, Beethoven, and Napoleon. Now, Napoleon is, I think, for a modern reader, a surprising one. Seems rather different than Goethe and Beethoven, but not so much so in the 19th century. Napoleon himself cultivated the myth of his own genius, and maybe it wasn't entirely a myth, but Napoleon, was very good at public relations. Even before, he was very concerned that people knew, for example, that he was involved in everything, right? So the French state, to this day, the French bureaucratic structure is Napoleon's creation, and he was very involved in the details of this, right? And of course, he was a brilliant, military commander, but he cultivated this image of himself as a genius, right? As a genius. Now, what does Napoleon have in common with Goethe and Beethoven that I may explain why Nietzsche brings these 3 up so often? Well, I think the crucial thing about each of them from Nietzsche's viewpoint, right, is that they transform people's perception of what's valuable in the different domains in which they work, right? That is, symphony is forever different after Beethoven, right? There's Mozart, right? And Mozart is wonderful, but Beethoven changes it, right? Haydn doesn't change it. Beethoven is the one who changes it. And after Beethoven, right, you couldn't have the symphonies that came later in the 19th century without having had Beethoven. Goethe is, of course, a modern Renaissance man, with enormous effects in literature, but in, optical science, in, what was called natural history in the 19th century. And Napoleon, of course, literally puts his imprint upon much of Europe, right? He imposes a vision of the modern European state on France and every other country he conquers. And to some extent, the countries he conquers, even after he loses, bear traces of the Napoleonic influence, right? In this regard, Napoleon, Beethoven, Goethe share something with, I think, the philosopher that Nietzsche most admires, whom he thinks of as the greatest philosopher, at least prior to Nietzsche, namely Plato, right? Because Plato is the philosopher who imposes a philosophical and a evaluative vision on the world for 2 millennia. Okay? And
Right.
you like to say, Christianity is Platonism for the people. Right? So Nietzsche thinks of, Plato, right? Plato is, what's so impressive about Plato is he's put his imprint on everything, right, that is coming after him in Western, philosophy and thought. So he is a creator of values on the big scale, right? And Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil that the genuine philosophers, not the philosophical laborers, he calls Kant and Hegel philosophical laborers. He says they press into formulas existing values. He says the great philosophers create values, or he says more precisely, they legislate them. And he thinks of Plato as a great legislator of values in that regard. But there's a way in which Beethoven is a kind of legislator of values within his domain. Right? So let me stop at that point. I went on a little too long, sorry.
No problem. I would like to ask you, what insights that come from Nietzsche about moral psychology have been vindicated by modern scientific psychology?
Yeah. So the final chapter of my recent book, which is co-authored with Joshua Knoll, who's a philosopher, cognitive science guy at Yale, tries to go through different aspects of Nietzsche's moral psychology that seem to have won a lot of empirical support. Mm-hmm. Nietzsche's idea that there are psychological types, and indeed that the psychological type of person you are is a heritable characteristic, that is, it can be passed on. A lot of very good evidence for that. Right? A lot of it coming out of famous studies done of twins that were separated at birth and raised separately, mm-hmm. but turned out to be extremely similar of psychological type. Nietzsche's skepticism about the importance of consciousness has won a great deal of support across many different aspects of contemporary empirical psychology. Not every detail, but the general picture seems to be basically right, that we overestimate how much important consciousness is, that we significantly underestimate the amount of our mental activity that participates outside the domain of consciousness, and that is absolutely crucial in explaining the things that we do. So I think that's another very important set of claims that find support in Nietzsche. I'm going to actually just look at my chapter to see if I've left out a particularly important one. Those are the two that immediately leap to mind. I think the role of affects and emotions in moral judgment and moral action has been significantly vindicated by empirical psychological research. That moral judgments really do depend upon an emotional and affective response, that a purely rational moral motivation is very, very hard to come by, very rare, that when people act in ways that we ordinarily appraise as moral, it's largely because of certain affective or emotional responses that they have. So I think that's another aspect of his view that has aged well over time. It's an interesting thing that empirical psychologists are largely unaware of this. I think it's partly because Nietzsche, that is unaware of the depths of Nietzsche's psychological insights. I think it's partly because some people still think he's just a Nazi, so forget that. And Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche's had a lot of influence. Derrida and the sort of French presentation of Nietzsche didn't make Nietzsche seem like a guy an empirical psychologist would be interested in. But, I think that the French and the Heideggerian readings of Nietzsche are, travesties. They are not very accurate. And they don't do justice to the things Nietzsche was really concerned with. To go back to something I said much earlier, when Nietzsche discovered the 19th century life sciences and 19th century psychology, he became consumed with it, right? And he was, as I say, a tremendous reader, right? I mean, he would even subscribe to some of the science journals, right, of the day, because he wanted to educate himself about this stuff, because he saw it as a dramatic, revolution in the way we think about human beings. And of course, the other great philosophical influence on Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, helped in this regard too, because Schopenhauer was a very good psychologist as well.
Mm-hmm.
And a separate book could be written about how Schopenhauer's psychology fares in light of recent empirical psychology. Schopenhauer has the problem that, of course, he's also this weird neo-Kantian. So there's all this other weird stuff, metaphysical stuff going on in Schopenhauer. But a lot of Schopenhauer is just straight up psychology, right? And it made a very deep impression on Nietzsche as well.
Mm-hmm. So just one last question also, because we're reaching our time limit, and on specifically that topic of why nowadays psychologists tend to be unaware of Nietzsche's insights on moral psychology or even psychology more generally. So can we say that Nietzsche is an Enlightenment philosopher? Because, for example, nowadays you get takes from people like Steven Pinker that because they associate him with romanticism and irrationalism and so on, they reject the idea that he is really an Enlightenment philosopher, but says that he falls more on the side of the reactionaries against the Enlightenment. But so what do you think about that?
I think it's complicated to answer that question, and Pinker's treatment is kind of simple-minded, though I understand what Pinker is reacting to. So let's separate out some aspects of what it means to be an Enlightenment thinker.
Okay.
You're an Enlightenment thinker because you believe in human equality and human liberty and, and the rights of man, or now the rights of humans, maybe the rights of non-human animals too. Okay, you could be an Enlightenment thinker in those ways, right? You believe in a certain sense of moral progress. That's clearly not Nietzsche. He's not an Enlightenment thinker in that way. He doesn't share those values, okay? He doesn't share in those values. You could be an Enlightenment thinker in the sense of thinking that by using human reason, right, we can, penetrate the depths of reality and improve the human situation. Well, Nietzsche's not really an Enlightenment thinker in that way either, right? He thinks that there are limits to what we can know, okay? And he doesn't necessarily, and he definitely rejects the idea that knowing the truth about things is going to improve the human situation. For Nietzsche, a lot of the truth about the human situation is terrible, right? It's shocking, okay? I mean, think about it. We're fundamentally creatures with strong drives towards cruelty, towards power, towards sexual gratification, right? Most people suffer by nature, okay? There is no God, there is no free will, right? We think we have free will, it's an illusion, right? These are some of the terrible truths that Nietzsche thinks we discover. But, right, he is very much a beneficiary of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution's expansion of our understanding of what human beings are really like.
Mm-hmm.
So this goes back to the point I made earlier. He was a big consumer of scientific literature in the life sciences, right? He took for granted that belief in God was unbelievable. That was an achievement of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, right? In those ways, right, the Enlightenment is indispensable for Nietzsche, right? That is, the growth in knowledge and scientific understanding of the world is very important for everything he's doing, right? And he's drawing on it sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly in all his work. But he's not a friend of the Enlightenment if you think of the Enlightenment as standing for human equality and democracy and freedom, right? And the liberty of all and the rights of all people and all non-human animals and so on, right? So he's certainly not Pinker's kind of Enlightenment thinker, though, as many people pointed out, Pinker's Enlightenment thinker is kind of a caricature of the actual Enlightenment anyway. But that's a separate topic. So I think that's the more nuanced answer to the question of Nietzsche's relationship to Enlightenment thought.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so Dr. Leiter, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Sure. Well, so if you Google my name, Brian Leiter, Leiter, and SSRN, that is an online repository of articles. You can find a lot of my articles, not all, but a lot of my articles on Nietzsche there, and you can download them for free. The book, Moral Psychology with Nietzsche, published by Oxford University Press in 2019, is now out in paperback. If you have access to a university library, it is also available through Oxford Scholarship online. And my earlier book, Nietzsche and Morality, came out in a second edition in 2015 from Routledge, and that is also in paperback. I am unsure whether that is available online, but it is available in a Kindle edition, as is Moral Psychology with Nietzsche. So thank you for that opportunity, Ricardo.
Very well. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you for including me in this excellent series. I appreciate all your work on this.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the channel. It's thanks to people like you that it keeps running, so I will leave links in the description box for PayPal and Patreon. Any amount, even just $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlight's Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters, Karen Litzke, and Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimir, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arnaud Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columba, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslin Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall. My producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Kian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Nirban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, and Sergio Quadriano. Thank you for all.